Looks like we're live. All right, looks like we're live. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We are here to talk about the battle against fraud, how banks and credit unions can fight back with identity. My name is Matt Torgerson. I am the CRO at BeyondID, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today. And our goal today really is to highlight for you some of the things that are happening in the industry. And our participants represent both Okta and BeyondID. If you're not familiar, Okta is the world's identity company, and it's the leading independent partner for identity management. And the vision for Okta is to free everyone to safely use any technology on any device. That includes workers, partners, customers, anybody that's in your ecosystem. BeyondID is an AI-powered managed identity service provider. We help customers simplify the complexity through advisory services, implementation, and longer-term support via managed services. Our goal is ensuring that customers get the most out of their investments in identity solutions. BeyondID has been the Okta Partner of the Year for the last 3 years running. So the two organizations work closely together to ensure that customers are always safe and that they have a strong security posture. Why this matters is we know that every organization is looking to serve customers via digital channels. That means your team is not face-to-face with your customers anymore, but rather just their digital presence. So how do we ensure that that digital presence is actually who you believe they are? Because fraud is rapidly evolving in financial services organizations, as well as companies across all industries need to stay ahead. We hear from leaders in financial institutions that the bad actors are constantly evolving their approaches in identity fraud. This includes technical methods as well as social engineering. These methods are accelerating and the costs are significant. In today's session, we'll break down how identity security can help banks and credit unions, or really any organization, fight fraud before, during, and after login. First, we'll talk about the evolving financial services fraud prevention landscape and some of the key fraud challenges, and how Okta and BeyondID working together can help stop fraud before, during, and after login. We'll talk about identity security and how it can prevent fraud at every login stage, and why it's the best combination to support fraud. So without any further delay, let's introduce our speakers. We have David Januchowski from Okta. He's our Senior Solutions Architect, and Vic Tapia from BeyondID, who's our VP of Solutions. Guys, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourselves and your background?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Dave Januchowski. I'm Senior Solution Architect at Okta. I've been here almost 4 years. Prior to that, I spent about a solid 15 years in actual FinServ companies, financial services, banks, both global and super regional, as well as in the healthcare payer space. So, a lot of my experiences kind of stem from being a developer up to a chief architect, and also being kind of an owner operator of implementing systems and dealing with a lot of the challenges that are out there. And one of my driving reasons to come to Okta is I felt they were positioned as one of the best in the industry to help combat fraud and other things around identity. So pleasure being here, and glad that you're working with BeyondID. And Vic, over to you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, my name is Vic Tapia. I'm the Vice President of Solutions here at BeyondID. I've been here approximately almost 3 years now, and spent the better half of the decade in the cybersecurity and identity and access management world. As predominantly part of my career was spent in Big Four firms, really helping and shepherding customers around their identity needs. And really a lot of my customers were around financial services, helping identifying security gaps, identifying fraud issues, implementing systems and safeguards to really understand and protect their data, their customers, their workforce, and ultimately how to meet their compliance needs. And one of the, similar to David, time and time again, I sought after primary identity and access management solutions such as Okta being the leaders, and we've identified a great synergy within a solution set that can really help financial service organizations combat fraud and ultimately become safer and ultimately grow their customer stance. So very excited for today, and thank you all for joining. Back to you, Matt.
Great. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. And what we're going to cover today is really, first off, the financial services fraud landscape. and some of the common threats that we're seeing. And it's, as we mentioned earlier, it's constantly evolving. We'll talk about how Okta and BeyondID are really helping organizations tackle fraud, and then how we can engage to support you. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The content here will be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. And during the session, if you've got some questions, drop them into the chat, and we will address them as we go through to the end. So to start off, David and Vic, can you give us a quick overview on how the fraud landscape is shifting in financial services?
Sure. So, a couple different things here that, when you think about, fraud, right, there's competing priorities at a time within the organization, right? You have your security, you have fraud, you have the digital experience you're trying to deliver both from a workforce or customer side, of course, leading to trying to increase revenue. But that at the center of all of this is identity. And fraud is a major issue, right? We certainly see it a lot within the financial services. We talk a lot about that. It certainly gets elevated because now we're talking about people's money and finances. But fraud is a serious issue across many industries. And again, it's impacting individuals, businesses, of course, financial institutions. At the end of the day, it takes form in many different ways, right? When you're thinking about financial services, we see some of the traditional ways, or legacy, I'll even call them, they're still happening, but you got check frauds, but then you get into more complex schemes such as identity theft and money laundering, counterfeiting, all these type things. But underneath all of that, right, which, many of these things get sort of exasperated by, fraud schemes, phishing schemes, things of that. And in addition to that, we've seen, an increase since, back in COVID, which seems a lifetime ago, but a lot of more folks went home and a lot more people were using home devices and things, and remote access was a big thing. So what we've also seen is that, not all devices and things, both corporate and non-corporate, are necessarily hardened and the right controls are in place. And at the end of the day, these things can range from small scale to multi-million-dollar losses. And they can affect somebody who's logging into an online banking, and even internal workers at a bank can be, phished with being able to send potentially a fraudulent wire, things of that nature. So again, this is far-reaching. If it's from the customer side, if it's within the workforce. And so, as we're kind of going through this, I'm curious through the comments and others, have you seen fraud on your side from both the customer side, the workforce side? When I say customer, I also think about prospect. People are thinking about maybe opening an account before they become a full-fledged customer. And then what are some of the challenges that potentially you're seeing in your own area that, might, in your own opinion, might be leading to some of this? But Vic, I'd also be interested in what you're seeing, especially being on the ground, working with a lot of our customers and doing some of the integration and being brought in to help sort of, shore up some of these potential gaps. So what are you thinking, Vic?
Yeah, absolutely, David. And I think obviously you covered, stating, part of the fundamental reason why we're all here is that I think we're seeing a common trend that fraud is pretty prevalent around the financial services industry, whether it's smaller credit unions to large, major banks across the U.S. And that fraud is extremely prevalent throughout. One of the things, that you mentioned was, obviously with the rise of digital banking and engagement through digital channels, as opposed to predominantly, physically going into branches and opening accounts, right, and brick and mortar locations, more of a rise has occurred in terms of those attack vectors that ultimately have led to fraudulent activity. Now more than ever, identity has become a means for bad actors to really gain unauthorized access to accounts, and ultimately leading to some of the fraudulent, costs, implications that you're seeing here, of ultimately leading to data breaches. One of the things that I think we have really predominantly heard a lot from working with financial services organizations is that there is still the notion that you really have to sacrifice experience in order to implement security safeguards that ultimately bring in the right controls to combat these type of bad actors and attack vectors, right, that are leading to this fraud. And our real standpoint is that we believe that you do not need to do that. We believe that you can still implement the right security controls and safeguards and mechanisms while still keeping a smooth and seamless experience for both your workforce and your prospective and or existing customers. as they engage through channels, digital channels, digital banking. At the end of the day, ultimately identity, right, is the core foundation of that. That's ultimately how we get to know our customers, how we get to know our prospects before they become customers, and also how we get to know our workforce, employees, and contractors. But ultimately, our stance is that security and experience together can have a synergy and ultimately provide that safe experience to protect the information, protect the data, protect the banks and the financial services organizations from fraud, but also provide, you know, those users that great experience that everybody's seeking out after, right? As you're growing through and you're seeking more customers, we want to be able to provide that experience and want to make it as seamless and as transparent as possible, right? That ultimately they feel comfortable, with their assets and their funds and in that organization. So ultimately,
and that's a sorry, Vic. I was just going to say that's a couple of great points, because really we're here really focusing in on the downside of fraud and how we can protect that, but we should not lose sight that the benefits of knowing your customer, of having an understanding of the view of your customer across touch points, all driven by identity, helps you provide a higher level of service. So a lot of benefits both on the protective side, but also on the upside of identity. So great points. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great point, Vic. And I think, you know, the thing that stood out for me where you talked about security and experience, and that's why it's also important, right? I think technology and certain capabilities that have sort of come to light, like phishing resistant authenticators and passkeys and other things, have helped sort of start to be able to blend those two. But it's also very important for financial crimes and others and security teams to work very closely with the experienced people, because you're trying to blend those together. And in the past, and again, working, you know, early in my career, it was kind of us and them. And it was like there was over there who was working on security, coming up with how to harden everything, and not necessarily always the best experience. And then, of course, on the digital side, it was about how do you provide the best experience. And I think, you know, again, working together is ultimately going to yield the best results for an organization. And then this slide here really is just, you know, one of the things is, and I'm sure many of the folks on the call understand this, that, you know, cyber attacks aren't unique to financial services, but they certainly are one that people want to go after. Why? Because there's more to gain. And that's why typically what we see, unfortunately, is the amount per breach and the percentage is always higher within financial institutions. And again, doesn't mean other organizations aren't vulnerable to these attacks. It's just where they're putting their time. And, you know, growing up in technology, you know, I'm a Mac user now. I used to use Windows for a long time, you know, but you would have some people say like, oh, you know, Macs are impervious to, you know, viruses and things like that. But it was a lot of effort was being put on the Windows to attack them. So it's not that, you know, you can argue if Apple is more resilient, but at the same time, a lot more effort was going against a certain OS versus the other. So again, you need to protect things all together equally. Next slide.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. Overall, you know, understanding the bad actors and ultimately what they're seeking out, what they're seeing on their side, right? Understanding ultimately, you know, what they have to gain is one of the things that I think the mindset has started to shift, and understanding that as the digital world and the digital identity has been so prevalent, there's a lot of more attack vectors and ways that they are targeting, you know, to cause fraudulent activity, right? And some of the things that we see on the slide here are just kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? We're seeing obviously account takeovers happening, you know, not, you know, as simple as, you know, calling existing customers, asking them, hey, I see some fraudulent activity in your account. You're going to get a code. I need you to provide that code for me so that we can safeguard your account, right? And this is happening across the board in all demographics and age groups, whether it's you know, brand new banking customers, like college students, all the way to elderly folks, right? That perhaps don't have they're not technology savvy, and overall everything from, you know, stealing credentials, right? As we think about, and we talked about the identity being at the core and identity being so important, it also holds a lot of the keys to the castle, right? And what that means is ultimately holding the keys to some of these accounts and assets that these customers have on there. So ultimately, you know, one of the things that we were going to talk about is, you know, how we can combat those, right? We understand the attack vectors. We understand why these bad actors are going after this industry so hard. And if we can understand the avenues of how they are attacking, we can better identify a strategy to be able to safeguard those and protect those appropriately. So David, any thoughts around some of the things you're seeing in terms of some of these top threats that we're seeing across the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm not gonna read through all these. I think these kind of look familiar, but I can just talk to a couple experiences from my time working as well as some, personal ones. In that, one of the banks I work for has been about 10 years now. One of the challenges, and this is kind of around like account takeover, is that, many people like to register for online banking. And those accounts are typically all eligible for somebody to do self-registration, give a bunch of information. You can register your online account and off you go. Well, one of the challenges we had back in the day was there were a lot of what I'll call kind of dormant online accounts, in that they were a certain population. We found out they were elderly. That doesn't mean that's the case today, but many people were looking at them as susceptible accounts. So they would go ahead, they would register, being able to register online and attempt to move out money in different ways. So kind of use them as mule accounts and other things. So, making sure that you understand with confidence who is on the other end is extremely important. And to the point we're going to stress, you're probably going to hear this a lot. Identity is key. And the other thing, as we're going through this, I want you to kind of recognize, there's not one vendor or one solution that combats all these things together, right? It's having the right ecosystem and partners working together, but certainly it does start and focus around identity. And sometimes things start outside. My in-laws, unfortunately, became a victim of a scam around Microsoft, where somebody kept telling them that their OS was out of date. Eventually, for some reason, they decided to call. The next thing, as they were working through it, they're like, oh, let's make sure your bank account information is correct. And they handed over the credentials to their online banking. And at that point, even though they had some MFA set up, they provided the one-time passcode. So some scams start outside. You see a lot around the phishing, and it happens in workplaces too, where they try to get to different information. I've heard stories of, some areas not wanting to implement MFA for their employees for accessing, for instance, their employment stuff or their pay, and doing so, it was on a small scale, but once their credentials became compromised, they started to reroute the individual's payment, their paychecks, to a different account, one by one. So again, some aren't these monolithical big, hey, somebody lost, 10 million records and all this other stuff. Sometimes it just starts out small. So I think it's important to think about all these different ones and how we can better protect. And again, I don't think anything's slowing down.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, David. And I think, one of the things I think we've talked about and concentrated a lot about is kind of safeguarding the customer, right? And I think, initially we discussed that, workforce is just as important to create those mechanisms and controls to understand, because ultimately fraudulent activity doesn't always, happen from external. It can also happen internal. I think a large bank organization in 2016 had an issue there, right, where a lot of bank employees created like millions of unauthorized accounts, in customers' names without their knowledge. They had a lot of, house sales pressures and unrealistic quotas that were met. And ultimately that was, fraudulent activity occurred there. Customers started to get charged fees for accounts they really never signed up for. And overall, it's organizations need to think through both internally and externally what type of controls and mitigation mechanisms to put in place to be able to identify fraud before it happens, right? And that's just a good example of one that came internally. So while external is really important, we always have to look inside as well.
Awesome. Yeah, next slide, please. So again, we're not going to go through all these in detail here, but there's different impacts across the board, right? From higher cyber insurance to lost customers to losing competitive edge and things like that. But one that did stick out, and I just mentioned it there, was the increase in cyber insurance, right? I mean, like everything else, I mean, you just think of our own personal lives, right? For if you live in an area that is more susceptible to hurricanes or fires or damage like that, typically what happens is you pay a higher rate. And now more than ever, because of what's happening, those who carry, companies and banks have to carry typically a higher rate of cyber insurance, and so do the vendors and partners that they deal with. But, when certain controls and things aren't in place, the likelihood is that's going to elevate some of your expenditures around what things are from that perspective, in addition to, regulatory things and things of that nature as well. And so ensuring that you have the right things in the right place are certainly important. Vic, what have you been kind of seeing or hearing out there as well from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, obviously, like the most glaring one that I think organizations see is obviously the financial losses piece, right, and reputational damage, right? It's customers. If how many times do we see a notifications? Oh, your account might have been part of a data breach, right, or a data leak, and the first thing that comes to your mind is, well, I lost faith in that organization or that brand, and you're less likely to engage them, or your perception of them definitely changes at that point. It gets altered in a negative fashion, and as it should, right? I think you expect customers expect a certain level of trust and a certain level of controls that they have in place as you're trusting them with a lot of your personal information. In this case, obviously financial assets, right, which is even more important for everybody. But to your point, right, there's an evolving wheel around compliance, right, and understanding those standards, and that's becoming an evolving door that is changing as the landscape and as the attack threats are changing, right, and are getting more towards cyber and identity focused. Those are changing as well. So your regulators are going to be asking different questions that they asked 5-10 years ago, just like the example you gave with the cyber insurance. Premiums are very different now, right, as the threats have changed, as the landscape has changed. That piece is also changed. But ultimately, the purpose really is to really understand that there is a massive impact, right, that fraud has across the entire organization, touches so many different stakeholders, and ultimately understanding that is one initial way of being able to identify ways and strategies to combat it appropriately.
Yeah, great points, Vic. And one thing before we go to the next slide, there have been attempts by legislation and things like that, like New York DFS, PCI 4, some of the bigger things that they're also trying to do in place around privileged access, especially around internal systems and things like that, but also making sure that there is MFA across the board, both internal and external, right? And that they're starting to really start to look to sort of enforce those points, right? I think the PCI one, a lot of us know of, and I know not everybody's from New York, but the idea there is really, New York attempted to put something out a while back, but there's been a concerted effort to really look to enforcement point on this and putting some new dates out there, which are happening this year, depending on the side of your company, but it really does stand alone, making sure you have some additional controls. And again, MFA by itself may not be is not the only thing you need, but you can start to see that too, that there are more regulatory things coming down to try to help better protect consumers from some of these fraud. So more to come on that. But next slide, let's talk a little bit about some of the fraud prevention use cases. So I alluded a little bit earlier, a statement that it's not one single capability or one specific potential provider or vendor to be able to provide all the different capabilities. But when you think about some of the important things within there is, and I'll kind of touch on them and then we can dive into them a bit. But you have verification, you have entitlements, you have, of course, MFA, you have behavior biometrics, and of course, real-time risk monitoring, right? So when you think about verification, like a lot of times when we register for things online, there's kind of a minimal amount of information, right? And even today, if you're looking at like an account number, date of birth, social security number, a lot of those have been, compromised based upon the letters, at least I receive every day, that talks about if it's from a healthcare organization or someone else that my information's been compromised. So we need more. We need to do some more verification of who somebody is on the other end before giving them controls. And I think what we have to think about is there's net new. Hey, this is the first time the person's showing up. Certainly we can do a lot of additional things like identity proofing and things like that with government IDs and verifying those things. But then we also have our existing population, right? And how do we sort of manage that, along with the fact that many of these things come with cost. And then, of course, entitlements, right? There's that sort of higher level. I may have access to bill pay or Zelle, or internally, I might have access to cash management or the Wire platform. But then it's also that finer grain is, what can I do as an individual, right? Are there certain accounts I can see? Are there limits on a day, per month, per week? All those type things. And then, of course, when we get into MFA, not all MFA is created equal. So we talk about things like one-time passcodes over SMS or email. Governing bodies like NIST have identified those are very weak and be compromised. So you start to need to look at more phishing resistant, authenticators, things of that nature, WebAuthn, being able to get a push notification with context to be able to know what is actually happening. And it's not just about when you log in. It's also transactional. Am I doing something that's different than I normally do? Is it elevated? Did the bank, which many have risk engines behind the scenes, is this an elevated risk? So back to what Vic mentioned about user experience. You don't want to prompt them constantly and give them MFA fatigue, but you want to be able to manage and understand what is risky, what is not. And then, of course, you get into behavioral biometrics. How do I move a mouse? How long does it usually take to click something? What are my movements like? And you're taking all these factors in to try to build a profile on somebody to start to understand, is it really them at the end of the day? And of course, we talked a little bit about sort of before, during, and after login. It's very important to have continuous monitoring and real-time data to understand what's happening. Not just I logged in, everything looked good at that point, because after the fact, if it's a customer or even in your own workforce environment, something could have changed. And if something received an elevated risk, what are you going to do about that, right? So when you think about these different use cases, those are some things to consider. And Vic, I mean, that was my perspective, but I'm really interested in hearing what you're seeing out there and what your perspective has been.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And I think you covered a great portion of it. And overall, really, you mentioned being wary from before, during and after, login and authentication. I think historically, the industry has really, defined a risk profile for a person that's become static. And I think the landscape has shifted where it really has to be real time and dynamic, right? My risk factor might be different before I log in and the risk signals are there. And then as I log in and determining what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, how I'm accessing it, that might change my risk factor at that point in time. And that might lead to me being prompted to do an additional verification step before I can complete something simple like a wire transfer to my spouse or to a vendor. And overall, really having the right mechanisms to identify at every engagement point, right? Before I log in, what am I trying to access? How am I trying to access it? How should I verify this person so that I feel comfortable as an organization to let them through that door? But that's not the only door that there is, right? Depending on where you're traversing, right? There might be a different locks on each doors. The one key point that I think goes back to a comment we made earlier is just having additional control mechanisms, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to become a friction point for users. Overall, right? You talked about MFA fatigue, right? I think obviously, a lot of folks have MFA fatigue and having OTPs and having to use different devices in your phone, et cetera, to log into things over and over again. And it causes frustration. If we implement things like flexible, factors like biometrics, right? Overall, those things make it a little bit simpler, but also provide a higher level of security that we can be more comfortable with as a financial services organization to let them through the door to verify they are who they say they are. And we feel more comfortable around there. Same thing with the behavioral biometrics, right? These are things that are happening in the background that's really not impacting the end user experience, but it is providing financial services organizations a better sense of security and a better sense of having control over what they're allowing folks to access and what capacity as well.
Next slide, please. Yeah, so one thing to recognize, when we're talking about, securing the total experience is that there's different stakeholders. These by no means are all of them, but we kind of try to identify, a couple key ones, right? Our customers, our shareholders, employees, and regulators, and there's a lot in between all of that. Some overlap, but some have some unique needs and things that they need to have in place, to feel secure and that we have to be able to manage those. Vic, do you want to talk about some of those differences maybe between some of these different stakeholders?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key, areas that I want to make sure that it kind of stands out in this slide is that overall, every stakeholder within an organization, cares about something specific, right? Employees care about, how easy is it for me to be able to access the systems that I need to log into every single day. Customers, as we talked about thoroughly, right, care about security and ease of use and how simple it is to engage with channels. And, shareholders care about cost, the stock value, and how to reduce risk, right? Regulators, et cetera. At the end of the day, the idea here is that a secure experience, right, when it comes to identity and security and really combating fraud touches everyone. Everyone should really care about this. That's ultimately what we're trying to be able to communicate, is that it really benefits and it impacts all these stakeholders across the board. I think it's very simple for us to predominantly think about, well, the customer experience, and only they are the ones that we care about. And ultimately, yes, they are an extremely important stakeholder, but it really does impact everyone. And ultimately, everyone from an organizational perspective adopt things like fraud prevention solution sets. Everyone's going to get a benefit out of that. It's going to drive the business, in a way that shareholders are going to be excited about and are going to see as a massive win. But also, it's going to help employees, and it's going to really aid in conversations from a compliance perspective that regulators have. So at the end of the day, I'm not going to go through these slides. There is a large benefit across the board, across these different personas that are all critical pillars of any financial services organization. And the idea is that this isn't an IT project, this isn't a security project. This should be a business strategy that touches every portion of the business. And ultimately, one of the things that we help customers with is identify ways that they can communicate and sell that to different business leaders and areas in business, so that they can properly communicate and identify how it's going to benefit the different pillars, right? So, David, just curious to hear your thoughts there as well. Overall, is this something that you're also seeing resonating in the field, right? As some of the financial services customers and organizations that you deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. I really appreciate your insights and kind of summarizing a lot of that. And, I was thinking to myself, there might be a pop quiz at the end of this webinar. And the answer to it is going to be, it all starts with identity. It's because when you think about all these different, if it's a customer, if you got shareholders, employees, whoever it is, and again, some of those are human identities and some of those are digital or machine identities. So when I say identity, I don't just mean a human on the other end, and that's an important distinction. But it all starts with identity, and once that is understood and there's a high assurance level there, a lot of these other things become easily more attainable and possible to be able to secure and provide the right experience. So yeah, totally spot on, Vic. Let's talk a little bit. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about sort of the architecture. So we attempted to sort of scale this down a bit. So some people might look at this and say, boy, this is kind of busy. And unfortunately, being an architect most of my life, I feel like this is scaled down and quite simple to follow. But what we're going to be talking about here a little bit is that you kind of need an overall fraud prevention architecture, and that, like, we kind of build on what we talked about in the last slide, is there's a bunch of stakeholders, again, not all, but within FinServes, there's different, you have your employees, you have consumers, you have business banking, you have wealth management, of course we have bad actors, we have new customers, and things there. And at the same time, there's many different engagement channels, some assisted, some unassisted, but you have folks interacting with digital in person in a branch. You have the ATMs, you have APIs, you have IoT. You think about your Alexa devices and Google Home, where you're asking it potentially, where you tied it to, your bank balance or something like that, right? And how to better secure those things. And again, that extends beyond, right? We're all used to it with maybe our streaming services like Netflix and other things. At the same time, on the bottom there, there's a lot of standards and certifications and interoperability. So you got things coming out like open banking, FAPI, NIST, PCI, FDX, OpenID, right? There's all these different bodies trying to, either better secure things, but at the same time, that comes with regulation and others, and you need partners to help you kind of navigate all of that. And on the right side, we recognize, and I, like I said, I spent a lot of time in FinServe as well as healthcare. And when I was in healthcare as a payer, working for like an insurance affiliate of Blue Cross, I thought that was pretty complicated, and there were a lot of systems. And then, when I got back into banking and my role expanded, the number of systems that banks have to interact with to protect, both from the customer side and the workforce side and all the different lines of business of what they're doing, is staggering. Here, I call out a few that are, in my opinion, kind of important, which is the online banking, of course, the core financial, but also some of the fraud capabilities they're really important around like fraud and AML systems, IDP proofing, risk scoring, security analytics. And as you go through this, right, and we're going to talk in a little bit more of a contextual, use case that Vic's going to kind of walk us through to help us kind of say like, okay, how does all this work together? But at the center of this, we have Okta. And that's where all the identity starts, right? That's where the control plane is. That's how you're able to kind of control access, be able to orchestrate the journeys to ensure that you're also enforcing things like strong customer authentication, right? Something something you are, and something you have. To be able to adhere to new standards coming out for third-party aggregators like FAPI, right? There's FAPI 1, there's going to be FAPI 2 soon. But the idea is that people have recognized that financial services is important, and there needs to be an elevated layer of security. In addition to that, we mentioned about these different systems. It's not one system or partner. You need to be able to have the ability to orchestrate and call different services, right? So that might be how do I verify a phone number hasn't just been created? And what is the reputation score on that? What about ID proofing? What about talking to a bank's one or more risk engines? And how do I take all that information, pull that in real time to determine that, is this a risky login? Is Vic Vic? Do I need to make a step up, some type of step up authentication? Do I need to verify him? The idea here is there's an overall ecosystem that needs continuous monitoring, detection, and remediation, and that is happening throughout the life cycle, before, during, and after. So as you look at this, hopefully this isn't overwhelming. Hopefully some of this does resonate with vendors you've worked with in the past. And one thing that I want to again stress is that owning identity for an organization is critical, because then you can control the journey, and finding partners whose sole purpose is identity and security is important versus, many of us have implemented solutions from online banking to other things where identity might be baked in or something of that nature. But again, think about where that core competency lies, right? Do you want to partner with people whose full-time job is to take care of some of this stuff, or sort of just a necessary sort of side thing, or maybe the investment in keeping up with all these increasing regulations, trends, and innovations is much more difficult? So just something to think about. And again, on here, I call out BeyondID, and Vic can talk a little bit more about that before we get to the next one. But one of the things is, a lot of times we have these systems that maybe don't perfectly talk to each other, and you need a partner who understands identity and who also can help connect some of these disparate systems, as well as help guide you through your journey on how to become a fraud focused company first. Vic, turn it over to you.
Exactly, David. No, and I think one of the things that you called out here, and to your point, this architecture is not meant to be daunting or complicated. It is definitely meant to show that there's orchestration and needed in order to really adopt the solution set. And why is that, right? Well, I think each of these components are good at what they do, and they have a specialization, right, that overall complement each other. So it's the notion of working better together, right? Okta is a leading identity and access management platform. For example, it is not an online banking platform, and same thing could be said for some of the online banking platforms here, or some of the financial apps, right? Every solution component has a role to play in the entire landscape and in the solution set. And being able to have that orchestration together, and being able to take the points that each of these components have, and being able to tie them together, before, during, and after login, to ultimately safeguard the entire experience, is critical here. That's really ultimately what we're trying to convey here is that there is not a single, I think, David, you mentioned this before, there's not a single software platform I can buy that's going to do all these things, right? Ultimately, what we've found to be successful is that identifying the core solution components that do what they're built to do, right? Okta is an identity and access management security platform that does what it was built to do extremely well. Similarly, for some of these ID proofing solutions, right? Your LexisNexis of the world, your SoCures, your Experian, your Clears, they were built upon a specific set of capabilities and use cases, and ultimately, integrating those together and orchestrating them together can help us have a much better, clearer vision, right, overall from the solution set. To your point, you mentioned a little bit earlier, and we can talk a little bit more towards the end of the webinar around ultimately, BeyondID has obviously made a lot of investments around facilitating the the orchestration and integration between identity platforms and some of these components that are on the right hand side, and bringing all that together, right? So having joint solutions with Okta around integrating with things like Q2, right, and identity proofing solutions, and ultimately coming up with a unified package with that can really customize and drive that engagement, right, that we've talked about. So I think one of the things that we've discussed is the better we get to know our customers and each of these stakeholders and personas on the left-hand side, the better we can understand them, the better we can safeguard them, right, and the better experience we can provide them. And ultimately, this overall fraud prevention solution we're discussing today takes all the appropriate signals from each of these components to ultimately output that type of experience we want, right, without compromising security. So maybe we can talk a little bit about it. A simple example, right, David, coming up here next of a typical, I know, end user experience that, you know, a lot of banking customers have through, and ultimately what type of safeguards, you know, are in the background. So if we can go to the next slide.
Take a look at that next slide if we can. Yeah, I can start it a little bit, and then Vic, if you want to kind of you know, add on here, is like, you know, again, thinking about that architecture that we just, you know, kind of walk through, and how does that actually show up in kind of a customer or user journey, right? One thing that you could put in front of this, and before you get to, you know, username and password or authentication, might be registration, right? That's where you might, you know, if somebody's registering, that's where you do some of that validation we talked about on, you know, is this a new email address? Is it a phone number? Has it just been created? Has it been used to try to open up, you know, 150 new accounts and things like that in the last few weeks, or identity proofing? We talk about username and password, and ultimately, you know, we are trying to get more towards a passwordless journey where passwords are a thing of the past. But in this stage, right, somebody's typically going to log in. There might be an MFA. You know, and this is where we talked a little bit about using an authenticator and biometrics over maybe like an OTP. At the same time, being able to do some device checks and things like that to understand, is the device, you know, have malware on it? Is it up to date? Is it compromised? And based upon those, you know, signals, determine that, well, do you let them log in at all? Do you realize that you might have to do some additional steps of security if that's MFA, that back to the identity proofing, because maybe it's an existing user, it has never been done, but you're looking for those location checks and possible travel, those type things, right? And again, real-time risk integration. Once that session is established, the important thing is that we're continuously monitoring it, right? So, you know, one of the things that as you're looking for partners and things, you want to make sure they adhere to standards, like through the OpenID group. So OAuth, SAML, things of that nature, right? But in this case, we're saying, you know, once that token's minted, that doesn't mean it's forever. You know, if there is some kind of risk indicator or threat that comes up, again, you could kill the session if needed. You can ask them to re-authenticate. And again, depending on how you also implement some of the authentication methods, if you think about, you know, using biometrics and things like that, you know, it can be a very streamlined experience to say something happened, I think we should kill their session and have them log in. But if you have some of these things in past, even though they would have to re-authenticate and establish the session, it's pretty seamless. And at the end of the day, maybe they're about to initiate a high risk transaction, a wire. Vic never initiated a wire in his life. He has the capability, hasn't done it, or he's done it, but boy, this is a $50,000 wire. Gee, normally he's doing 1,000. So again, this is where you get into that additional risk scoring of that activity on Vic, not across the board. Because for myself, maybe I'm doing $50,000 wires all the time for, you know, various reasons. But for Vic, it was definitely out of his normal pattern. And so we want to be able to potentially challenge him, log him out, whatever the case may be. And then at the end of the day, you want to be able to complete that transaction and all the information that was collected and done throughout the journey. So you want to be able to centralize all that information within your log system, so that, you know, when it gets down to your security team and the NOC and all that, they can start to see what has happened, when it happened, where it happened from, and also feed that back into your risk engines so that it starts to build a new extensive continuous profile on Vic as you're kind of going through. So you're kind of taking the activity of the journey and you're looking at different safeguards to sort of match up with that and be able to protect that. Vic, what's your perspective on some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said a couple of things that really resonated with, that we're seeing in the industry is, you talked a little bit about the risk profiles changing. I think we talked about how that has to be dynamic, right? And I think historically, I think a lot of, and a lot of the customers that I've dealt with in the financial services space, they've defined and put together static policies, right? From a security aspect, everyone that goes through the specific engagement channel has to jump through these safeguards to go through. But to your point, right, if we have a better understanding and different risk signals and overall understanding of where they're coming from, how they are accessing, what they are trying to do, we can dynamically change how we engage and ultimately what we ask the user to be challenged with, right? As we traverse through this simple journey of just somebody logging in, whether they're registering, to your point, or their existing customer that they're logging in just to doing a simple wire transfer to somebody else, we can see ultimately here all the different solution components we saw in the architecture diagram in the previous slide are at play here, right? We're getting signals from so many different solution components to help us identify and build a risk profile and then determine what do we want to do with that, right? What is going to be our decision matrix to determine what we are going to show or not show the end user. And all of this is ultimately fairly seamless from an end user perspective, right? A lot of these checks that are happening, device location checks, the behavioral biometrics we talked about, the learning of, hey, David does $50,000 wire transfers all the time and Vic only does 1,000. Those, the user has no idea that's happening in the background, right? Again, we talk about not sacrificing experience for security. This is a good example of that. Is we're doing all these checks, right, and having the right solution components, right, the ID proofing solution, right, the fraud products. They're all giving us specific information that we intake, and then from there determine ultimately what the risk profile is, and that is an ever going exercise. And to your point, David, one of the things that we need to think about is how does that dynamically change? It has to learn over time, right? Overall, ultimately, and that's the one thing that we're seeing now is that it's the landscape is changing, and that model has to learn over time. And I think obviously AI being a huge component nowadays in the security world, that's a key component that we could leverage to be able to help really learn user and behavioral patterns to help mold what the security policy mechanisms should be and what the risk profiles should be. So.
Absolutely. And when we go to the next slide, Vic, I was wondering, I know, you've worked, with a very specific credit union and trying to help them sort of enhance their overall digital experience, identity, fraud. As we go to the next slide here, I'd really be interested in kind of, we talked a lot about a stuff that hopefully is resonating with folks as far as, here's a reference architecture, here's some use cases, but this is actually, now we're talking about implementation here, right? This isn't just us talking about it. This is someone who kind of took all of what we were talking about and started to kind of enhance their own fraud journey.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, in Texas, the Employee Credit Union, or in short, TDECU, had overall a very large, fraud problem. I talked a couple of examples, right, of ways that, their members were being targeted, right, and were leading to a lot of fraudulent losses for TDCU, and everything from, all the attack vectors we discussed, right, phishing, social engineering, even, people going physically and knocking on people's doors and, pitching ultimately fraudulent activities and having some of their existing members provide the keys to their digital identity and their accounts. And overall, we partnered with TDCU and ultimately came up with implementing the solutions that we've just been talking about, David, right? And ultimately that is, how can we identify that identity really is at the core component of this, and what type of solution components can we ultimately, orchestrate together to give us a better understanding of where fraud is coming from. Ultimately, what channels are driving a lot of the fraud, and what are those KPIs and metrics around it, and how can we put together a strategy that mitigates those specifically. So one of the key components that TDCU had was, well, from an IT perspective, it was very simple, right? We put all these safeguards in place, and it's very simple. We're going to reduce our fraud by X%. But what does that mean from an end user perspective, right? So partnering with their marketing and digital channel leads and pillars was critical for their success, right? And we talked again, I reiterate the point of, not sacrificing user experience for security. One of the things that was brought up by TDECU is, we have a lot of elderly members that, change is difficult, right? Change, they're going to see a new safeguard, a new control, and, we're worried that they're not going to engage with us in the same way that they did. And it's going to cause friction. It's going to cause us to, for them to go elsewhere. So working with them to really understand how can we ensure that these additional safeguards, right? We implemented an identity proofing solution, right? That all through registration and login was prevalent ultimately to determine, to answer the question, are you say who you say you are before we go in there? And is it fraudulent activity? Is it a fraudulent account or not? And ultimately understanding and partnering between their different lines of business to be able to communicate appropriately. What does this change mean? What does it mean for you as a business stakeholder? What does it mean for the end user? And ultimately getting everybody comfortable, I think was one of the key components that really helped us be able to be successful and sign this across the board in the organization. Because ultimately, I think we all understood that the strategy made sense, right? We understood the challenge was there was a lot of fraud happening at the bank and they were losing millions and millions of dollars. But ultimately, how do we solve it? And how do we solve it in a way that we understand is going to be appropriate for our members and for the organization as a whole as they're adopting this, digital first and identity first security strategy. So coming up with partnering with Okta and some identity proofing, solutions like Plaid ultimately led to TDCU adopting this entire solution set and identifying that this was the right strategy forward. And it came ultimately by coming together and being able to ultimately bring to light, all the different, slides that we've discussed and the components of it. So it was a great success story. And, we all know that credit unions, if credit unions are having this issue, we know that every financial organization has this challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point, Vic. I could close my eyes, not read the name of this company, and could tell you it could be anyone.
Exactly.
Because I think a lot of folks are having this issue, big, small. And it brings me back. Unfortunately, I think I've been in industry too long sometimes because I have a lot of stories. But it does resonate with me as well in one of my previous roles where it was around Zelle. We had some things like identity proofing in place. We wanted that as part of the solution, working with our financial crimes team, because we weren't necessarily. This was going to be really one of the first ability, and it's I say real time. It's not real time. It's still using old technology behind the scenes to move money, but it was the first time to move money real time from person to person and really accelerate potential fraud losses. But one of the first things that was cut out of the budget was the identity proofing because they felt that was the cost, didn't necessarily justify. And in the news, Zelle got a lot of, bad press on, fraud losses and things like that. And, from my experience and what I've seen is, a lot of that was because there weren't the appropriate controls in place before letting somebody fully enroll. And so sometimes it's not the underlying technology that per se is bad. It's sort of the things in front of it. And I think, this credit union's journey and commitment to recognizing they needed to put in technologies like identity proofing and things like that and be smart about where it is, when it is. I mean, you certainly need to understand the value of your assets and what you're protecting. But at the end of the day, I applaud them and applaud you for getting them to a better place, because I think we've all seen it way too many times. And even in our own things that we interact with, having a security question and answer really isn't enough. In an OTP and setting up MFA when you're not exactly sure, has that account already been compromised on the other end? You have somebody to add MFA, give you a phone number, and you're doing SMS. Do you really know that's the other person on the other side? So those are things to be thinking about as we go forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to ultimately lead to, ultimately what can I do if I'm a financial services organization to start this journey, right? What are the next steps, right? I think, if I were to think about, okay, David and Vic, I'm bought into what you said. What do I do next, right? And I think it's a good segue to talk about ultimately what the initial next steps could be in adopting the solutions.
Yeah, let's bring that next slide up. And one thing I'm gonna let Vic continue on with this. But one thing is, I seen a little cartoon or meme, a cartoon on I don't know if it was Facebook or whatever it was. And it talked about increasing your knowledge and where that comes from. And I like to, think that, I've done a lot in school and other things, and I'm a smart individual, but honestly, the most of my experience and where a lot of this comes from is from failures and learnings. Being part of different organizations where some things went well, some things didn't go well, seeing what others have done, where they fell and how to improve. A lot of our learnings, come from, failures. And I think, within our industry, amongst others, there's been a lot. And being able to take that, and that's why, like, I was kind of passionate when Vic and others and BeyondID asked us to do this, is that we're just trying to kind of provide our personal experiences on where we've been and what we've seen. And some of that is, yes, we've thought about some innovative things along the way, but along that way too is, there's been some failures along that journey of our careers. And that's kind of what I think has made at least me smarter and more passionate about this whole topic of fraud, and how do we do better, so that others are better protected. And again, we're far beyond the days where we're thinking we were in some kind of digital age. And I think AI is changing everything. And I think we really need to be prepared and really make sure that we have the right groundwork in place. And Vic, others, please talk about how maybe if people are interested in how we can share those experiences and help them, how they can engage us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think just to quickly wrap up the slide, right, just to talk through these 3 bullets that are on here really quickly. I think overall, the first couple steps, right, are really evaluate where's your identity program and strategy today, right? One of the things we looked at when we started engaging with TDCU is ultimately where their identity stack was today, what type of identity controls they had today, and ultimately build from there. That's ultimately your baseline, your foundation to ultimately adopt what's the gap, what's remaining there, right? And we made number 2 talks about identify your potential fraud exposure. So really quantifying, like, how much fraud, am I seeing in an organization today? And ultimately, where is that coming from? Is it coming from predominantly a specific engagement channel? Is it coming directly from mobile banking? What type of users? Ultimately, identifying patterns, right, that we can map to, and coming up with KPIs and true quantifiable metrics. We can help identify that. We partner with identity proving solutions to really take some sample data that is coming from the banking platforms to identify, if you implement this solution set, this is how much percentage of fraud you're going to see be reduced, right? And ultimately really quantify that, again, as we talked about, being able to sell this appropriately across the organization. And then once we identify where the fraud is coming from, right, and identify those patterns, how do we prioritize what type of mitigation strategies, control solutions, and components do we need in place in order to combat that specifically? So getting really surgical about, not just, buying all these different things and putting them together, but identifying where am I going to get the most value out of the investment, right? And being able to identify where your holes are going to help us better to understand that. So part of that strategy and that shepherding of identifying 1, 2, and 3 is where, BeyondID and Okta comes in, and we folks like, TDCU are prime examples of organizations that we've helped kind of shepherd through this process and really start that journey, right, to be able to ultimately adopt the overall fraud prevention solution that, we've been chatting, David.
Well, guys, I appreciate the depth of experience and a lot of the things we've talked about. We ran a little over on content, so I think we're going to have time for just 1 or 2 quick questions. One of the things that I think is really critical, and David mentioned it, is AI. So one of the things that was asked is, we've seen a huge uptick in fraud with the rise of AI. What role do machine learning and AI play in fraud detection, and how can financial institutions and others leverage these tools to improve security measures? Probably a question we could have a whole nother webinar on, but would love to hear your quick response on where AI fits both on the offensive and defensive side of security.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll love your take on this, David. I think overall, one of the key areas where AI can really kind of facilitate is, we talked a little bit about learning, activities and behaviors in your customers a little bit better, right? And really analyzing their behaviors, right? So simple things like analyzing transactions, right, at an extremely high rate to be able to detect anomalies is one thing that I think AI is going to be adopted more, that we can leverage that. Same thing when I talked about the behavior analysis and risk scoring, right? Being able to have a language model that can really track and identify and understand user behaviors. What are their habits, right? Why do they log in, differently today than they did, a couple days ago? Being able to more quickly identify and pull together all the different, data sets to be able to come up with a risk factor and a risk profile that we can then take appropriate action for. So overall, I think it's being able to consolidate all the information appropriately and being able to detect, is this a potential fraudulent activity much faster, I think is where AI can really, really help facilitate and aid in the solution set. David?
Yeah, and to add on to that, right, what AI does a great job at, especially with version 4 of ChatGPT, is it's really predicting the next word or the next thing that can happen and what the probability of that is, and the more data that you have, and so for instance, Okta has 19,000 customers and a billion logins a month, but by having access to this data, right, we have an advantage to be able to see some of those and expand on, like what Vic was talking about, not just what an individual is doing, but what trends and activities are we seeing across the board, in addition to make recommendations based upon how your system's configured, what policies you have in place, to if you do have vulnerabilities or gaps or things that we're seeing out there. So it's being able to take that information continuously at a higher rate, as Vic mentioned, and that's where like technology has caught up, the ability to process these large amounts of data in short amounts of time, but also provide predictive next steps to take, and provide insights on how to better protect yourself against potentially unknown threats that we're not even thinking of, right? And so that's where I see AI and the incorporation of it playing a large role within sort of this whole fraud and risk mitigation strategy.
All right. Well, guys, I appreciate all of the input and the valuable conversation. I think we're at the top of the hour, which I think is about where we planned on ending. So I appreciate everything that you put together and your preparation. And all the folks that joined and stuck with us for the 60 minutes, definitely appreciate it. Reach out to us. You can see our emails online. I will on the screen. I will make one correction that my name is actually SEN at BeyondID, but we're definitely all looking to make sure that we can connect, and look forward to speaking with you all. So thanks very much, and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks all.